Um, Good afternoon and good evening to all of our colleagues in Africa, and good morning to everyone else on this call. I'm Jane Drake, Director of Global Operations at UCSF, and I'm pleased to welcome you to a COVID-19 Q&A session with Dr. George Rutherford. Dr. Rutherford, as many of you may know, is also the Vice Chair of the Global Programs Board of Directors. You may already be familiar with him as the PI of a number of PEPFAR-funded projects supported by Global Programs offices. He is also the head of the Division of Infectious Disease and Global Epidemiology in the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics at UCSF, and leads the Global Strategic Information Group within the Institute for Global Health Sciences. He has worked for many years in public health with an emphasis on the epidemiology and control of communicable diseases, both domestically and internationally. During the pandemic, Dr. Rutherford has been an invaluable source of reliable information about COVID-19 and the current vaccines. We are grateful to him for taking time out of his very busy schedule to share this information with Global Program staff. A number of questions were sent to us in advance. We also encourage everyone to submit questions during the webinar by clicking on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen and typing in your questions. I will now turn the session over to Dr. Rutherford.
Thanks very much, Jane. It's a pleasure to be with all of you virtually today. And I'm looking forward to this. So what I thought, I might just start off with saying a few words about the vaccines. There are a large number of vaccines that have been developed or are at various stages of development. I think the last count was that there have been that there are 50 in phase 1, 37 in phase 2, 32 in phase 3. 8 have been authorized for early or limited use. Another 8 have been fully approved by various regulators around the world, and then 4 have been abandoned. This is quite the lineup of vaccines. So you can understand that I may not have all the specifics for individual vaccines right off the top of my head. The vaccines, the issue. So we basically have 3 types of vaccines currently. We have one that uses messenger RNA, the mRNA vaccines, in order to stimulate cells to produce just the spike protein, the protein that the coronavirus is used to attach to cell walls. So you create antibodies, you create immunity against the spike protein. The mRNA doesn't enter the nucleus of the cell. It stays in the cytoplasm. It goes to for those of you who remember your molecular biology, it goes to the Golgi apparatus, where it's turned into protein. Okay, so that's the first one. Those are the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines predominantly, which are been hugely successful in the United States. The second type of vaccines use adenoviruses, incomplete adenoviruses, to put the coding machinery for the same spike protein into the nucleus of cells, and have the nucleus create the mRNA that goes out to the Golgi apparatus and then produces the protein. That's the AstraZeneca vaccine. That's the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. And that's the the CanSino vaccine, and the Gamaleya, the Russian vaccine. The third, I'm sorry, there are 4. I should have said that. I was going to skip one, but it turns out it's actually being used. The third is something that's just starting to come out online, and I suspect we'll see it authorized in the United States here fairly soon, which are vaccines that are just proteins. This is like the hepatitis B vaccine, where you're injecting the protein. So in this case, you're injecting the spike protein. It doesn't have to be manufactured. It's already been manufactured externally. You just inject the spike protein with a lot of adjuvants around it and stuff. and that will stimulate immunity. And that's the Novavax is the U.S. version of that, and there's another Russian one called Vector. And then finally, there are inactivated vaccines, and inactivated vaccines are old technology. This is what we do, for instance, for the Salk vaccine for polio. This is what we've done for Haemophilus influenzae. This is what we do for meningococcal disease. We inactivate the organism and inject the whole organism. So those are inactivated vaccines, and there are 3 Chinese vaccines and 1 Indian vaccine that are either in late stage approval or have been or are being used. So those are Sinopharm and Sinovac. Sinopharm and Sinovac are the big ones. Those have been particularly problematic in a couple of countries where there are high levels of vaccination, but there's ongoing transmission, especially the Seychelles and the country of Chile in South America. So just remember there are 4 types. Now, the other part of vaccines are the variants and all these different viral variants that are circulating. So far in the US, the mRNA vaccines have been great against all the different variants. They work well, they're solid, and they have performed well in massively limiting transmission. And by massively limiting, I mean like 99% declines. In other countries, the variants are kind of a little bit more complicated. In South Africa, for instance, the AstraZeneca vaccine has not worked well against the beta or B1351 or South African variant, whatever you want to call, and was sort of removed from consideration very early on based on a small study. And maybe Marina can tell us if she's on the line, where we are with the South Africans and AstraZeneca vaccine right now, but that was the one that was decided not to be used. In other places, it's all pretty straight. The vaccines are all working pretty well, and they're with the exception of these inactivated vaccines, and that's what we're seeing worldwide. So, going to the questions, Jane, is that right? That's what you want me to do? Okay.
Yes,
Okay.
I think we can start off with the ones that were submitted in advance, and then I'm seeing we're starting to get a few additional questions.
Okay. So the first one is it necessary to know one's COVID status before vaccination, i.e. if somebody's already infected, should they be vaccinated or not? And what exactly happens in my body if I'm already COVID positive? So it's unnecessary to know your vaccination status. In the United States, the recommendation is for people who have been infected with COVID to receive 2 vaccines. In other countries, specifically France, they only recommend a single vaccine. I think school is out on it's still an open question on whether you need 1 or 2 vaccines, but you certainly need 1. And what happens in the body if you're already infected is you just have a more augmented immune response, because the vaccine derived proteins will re-stimulate the immune system to give you a bigger boost. Okay. Is it true that the vaccines help us only for 8 months? How long is the effectiveness of the vaccines, of our vaccine above 8 months? So we know the first vaccines went into people in April of 2020. So we know that they work for 14 months. Right now, there is no reason to suspect that they won't last for a long time, like years. What the problem is if the variants change, and so what we're vaccinating against, what we told your immune system to recognize, changes. That has not yet happened. It is theoretically possible, and the U.S. at least has, and COVAX have contingency plans that's certain that we may need to give a second jab or third jab down the line at some point in time, but there are no current plans for doing that in the United States. COVAX, the WHO, the UN agency or the UN program on COVID vaccine, has yesterday, for planning purposes, said that they would give that they were planning on giving a third dose to people who were immunocompromised or otherwise unlikely to develop immunity after vaccination. And those are specifically people who have had solid organ transplants, like a kidney transplant, or who have had who are on drugs to suppress their immune systems for either because of cancer or because of autoimmune diseases like rheumatoid arthritis. And there's a very specific part of the immune system that gets suppressed that makes the vaccines not work as well. So COVAX has said those people may need a third vaccine, but in the US, there's no recommendations about that yet. I think we might end up there though. Okay. What's the longest time that should be spent between the first and second shot of vaccine? What happens when the time is over? Start vaccination afresh. This is a great question. So these intervals of 3 weeks for Pfizer and 4 weeks for Moderna, and I don't know what it is for AstraZeneca. I think it's 4 weeks, but don't quote me on that. These 2-shot vaccines, those periods of time are minimum periods of time, not maximum periods of time. So when the trials were done, the question was how fast can we get people immune to this? And so they were looking at how short the interval could be and still work. You know, an ideal timing would be something like 4 months probably. Right now, I think that the current recommendation is if you get the second dose within 6 months, that's good enough. If it's after 6 months, you might have to restart the series. Okay. That last part about 6 months is off the top of my head. I don't think there's a specific recommendation about that. But understand, the bigger the interval, the better the immunity will be. And this 3 and 4 week intervals are about how fast we can give it and still get reasonable levels of immunity. If we were to lengthen that out, it would be even better. And as you know, in Britain, or you may know in Britain, their vaccine strategy was to go through and vaccinate everybody once with the AstraZeneca vaccine and then come around again a few months later and give everybody their second dose. They thought that 1 dose was a good way to do this in the face of relatively limited supplies. Okay, a fourth question. Some people who are vaccinated have fallen ill. I personally have come to know 2 people who are vaccinated and have died of COVID-19. So why should I go for the vaccine? Well, currently in the United States, the estimates that your unfortunate 2 friends, and I'm sorry about that, represent about 1 in 10,000 people who get the vaccine. In the United States, the data just came out. There are something like 150 deaths among people. This is in a relatively recent period of time. 150 deaths among people who had received vaccine versus, I want to say 300,000 among people who hadn't received the vaccine. So it's a huge difference. And the vaccines are very protective. There are rare instances of breakthrough. When these kinds of things occur, the question to ask is, were there problems with handling the vaccine? Vaccine mishandling, especially for vaccines like this that have very sort of complicated cold chain requirements. The reason they fail is because they somehow got heated up and it's killed off or denatured the active ingredients. So that's I would imagine that's a scenario. Another thing is they might have been immunosuppressed, especially if they had HIV infection, which turns out probably to be somewhat one of these things that might make the vaccines a little bit more difficult to work, especially if you have very low T cell counts or have a lot of ongoing replication with high viral loads. Okay, so the reason you want to get vaccinated is that it works almost all the time with rare exceptions. And unfortunately, you've hit up against 2 of the rare exceptions. And you want to get vaccinated to protect yourself, to protect your family, and to protect your community. It is said the virus mutates. That's absolutely true. So when there are new variants now in one vaccine, does the one vaccine serve for all the variants? And the answer to that is yes, more or less, with the exception of this adenovirus and the beta variant in South Africa. The thing to remember about your immune system is that it's redundant. We have humoral immunity, which are the antibodies and B cells and plasma cells. And then we have cellular immunity, which you all will be very familiar with because of HIV, and that's T cells. So a lot of the articles you read are looking just at antibody, which is not the right way to do this. You need to look across the immune system to both arms of the immune system, the T cell arm, the cellular arm, and the humoral, the B cell arm. And I think what we've found, not I think, I know what we found, is that these vaccines are very protective, even in the face of very specific types of variants. Could there eventually be a variant that evades our current vaccine? Yes, it's possible. It's just not very likely at this point in time. And the trick with variants is that viruses have to be replicating in order to mutate. So the more people that are vaccinated, the lower the incidence of viral infection is, the lower the number of new infections there are. That means the less over an entire community, that means the less virus that's replicating, the fewer the mutations will be. So the trick with variants is to get high levels of immunization in countries and communities, and that way there won't be virus replicating, and that way there won't be new mutations. So that's the real trick. Good question. 6, can one use a vaccine from India for the first injection and another vaccine from the USA for the second injection? Not regularly recommended, although the Europeans have started to do this now, where they've gotten the first dose of AstraZeneca vaccine, an adenovirus vaccine, which is the one that's being produced by the Indian Serum Institute. And then the second dose is a mRNA vaccine like Pfizer. And Angela Merkel herself, the Chancellor of Germany, got that combination the other day. This is being studied formally in Europe. And I think the answer is, while it's probably not the world's best practice right now in the absence of data, it's certainly being widely done. And I think if your choice is between getting a second vaccine, an mRNA vaccine from the US after you've had an adenovirus vaccine, versus waiting around for longer for another adenovirus vaccine, I personally would probably go ahead and get the mRNA vaccine. Let's see, the 7th one. Is it true that the first jab weakens the body immunity for the first few days? No, not really. I mean, it's a what you feel, and this is especially true after the second dose, by the way. You feel sort of sick after the second dose, and I kind of felt that way after my second dose. I felt sort of like I had flu was coming on. And what that is interferon. And what you're responding to is this sort of push for your body's ramping up its immunity. So what is said, I'm not sure this is true, but it is said that after the first dose, you get, it stimulates your B cell immunity or humoral immunity, the ones that create antibody. And after the second dose, it stimulates your cellular immunity, the T cell immunity. And that's why you get high levels of interferon that's associated with T cell immunity. All right. So some more from Mozambique. Those were from Uganda. Thank you very much for putting them forward. So questions about COVID-19 vaccination in Mozambique, where there's AstraZeneca, Sinopharm, and Sinovac. And as I said, Sinopharm and Sinovac are inactivated vaccines. So what is the safest and most effective vaccine? Well, those are two separate questions. Clearly, the most effective of those three is the AstraZeneca vaccine. And I think because you have to include vaccine failure as part of the safety equation, I think AstraZeneca is also the safest. There may be fewer side effects from the Sinopharm and Sinovac, but they also only have about 50% protection. Hey, are these vaccines safe if you have underlying medical conditions that put you at risk for COVID, like asthma or high blood pressure? Absolutely, positively. In fact, those are indications for getting vaccinated earlier and not contraindications. Do these health conditions impact possible reactions to the vaccine? No. There are issues around people who have been immunosuppressed for a variety of reasons. Let's set HIV aside for a second. People who are receiving immunosuppressive drugs to treat cancers, to treat autoimmune diseases, might have decreased take of the vaccine. And in that scenario, if you're taking steroids for asthma, you might have that may impact the uptake of the vaccine. There are guidelines that are from some clinical groups about how to time doses of these kinds of drugs in order to assure that the vaccine takes. So you'd have to talk to your doctor about that. But I think in general, what we're talking about is that the vaccines will work well, and they're totally indicated in these situations. If you're taking immunosuppressive drugs, including steroids, that creates some timing issues about when the best time to get vaccinated is. With HIV infection is also an indication for vaccination, especially because a lot of these variants, or some of the variants that we're seeing, are coming out of people. So when we talk about variants, I said it has to do with the amount of the virus is replicating. Even more importantly, as a subset of that, is how much the virus is replicating in an individual. So if someone remains viremic, if they have circulating virus for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, they're a lot more likely to have the selective pressure to create resistant variants. So, and that happens in people with HIV infection. In South Africa, that's one of the reasons that was this early, the beta variant. So, that has a possible, the disease itself has a possible impact on the course of COVID if you were to be infected, and it also has an impact on the emergence of variants. So for that reason, we really want to vaccinate people with HIV infection, but understand the vaccine may not have the same vaccine effectiveness. It may be slightly lower, and that they might be another group that would need a third vaccine down the line once those studies are done. Is there a risk of long-term effects from the vaccines? No, there is no evidence of long-term risks from the vaccines. There are 2 conditions that have arisen in vaccine safety studies. One are clotting disorders, where people start getting thromboses or clots, blood clots, and that's with the adenovirus vaccines, the AstraZeneca vaccine and the Johnson & Johnson vaccine that's used in the US. If you've had clots before, you should probably get different vaccines. The second thing that's happened, it's just come out this week, is that there is a risk of inflammation of the heart muscle, especially in adolescent boys who are getting who've gotten the mRNA vaccine. In the US, we vaccinate down to 12 years of age right now with the Pfizer vaccine. There's a long meeting at CDC on Wednesday, and the conclusion was that it's far more important to get the vaccine with its small attendant risks of heart muscle inflammation than the actual disease, where there's a very high incidence of heart muscle inflammation. And the heart muscle inflammation, which is called myocarditis, by the way, turns out to be transient, and with just rest and maybe some non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, it's totally treatable, and people have recovered. Basically, everyone's recovered from it. Okay, we have heard of people who received the vaccine and died a few hours later. Could this be a reaction to the vaccine? It's possible that they also had underlying medical conditions. I can absolutely guarantee you that's true. So if you take and immunize everybody in a nursing home, for instance, where basically somebody dies every day, if you have you're going to have deaths that are totally coincidental in time with vaccination. And so I don't worry about these things very much. The one exception is that they had an anaphylactic reaction to the vaccine, which does occur rarely. In the US, it's estimated to be about 1 in a million doses. And they were unable to be treated. You have to give steroids and epinephrine and Benadryl to treat anaphylactoid reactions. These are these intensive immune reactions where people's throats swell up and stuff. That's that could potentially have happened, but I think that stuff would all be witnessed. It happens very fast after the injection, like within a few minutes. Okay, so those are the questions I had. Jane, do you have other?
Sure, we're getting quite a few questions in the Q&A box, and which is great. I just want to say Marina did respond about South Africa, and they're currently using J&J and Pfizer. 500,000 healthcare workers have been vaccinated with J&J, and 2 million Pfizer doses have been administered so far to the elderly. So that's the South Africa status. And I'll just go through these questions.
Let me just add something about the J&J vaccine. That's Johnson & Johnson. It's actually the Janssen division of Johnson & Johnson, and Janssen is how you say Johnson in Danish, just to confuse everything. But that's a single dose. You only need 1 dose of that, and then you're immune 2 weeks later. So that's the attraction of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. But it does have this problem with platelets and clotting, but it's exceptionally rare as well. Jane.
Okay. Here's a question. What is the latest data showing around whether fully vaccinated folks can still carry and transmit the virus?
Okay. So they don't carry or transmit the virus. If they happen to be a vaccine failure, again, about 1 in 10,000, and they are infected, yes, they can transmit the virus. But it apparently is, even in that situation, they have much lower levels of virus in their noses and are probably not as aren't as infectious as people were who have not been vaccinated. So yes, it can occur, but it only occurs in the setting of a vaccine failure. It's not like people can carry this asymptomatically and transmit it. When they're immune, they're immune. They don't get it. They don't transmit it. Done. Except in these rare cases of vaccine failure.
Oh, okay, great. And here's a question. I think you talked about some of these things already. What are the known side effects of the major vaccines, and how many deaths have resulted in relation to total vaccination?
So the question is that, to my knowledge, there have been 0 deaths that have resulted from vaccination. Again, the primary cause of death would be anaphylactic reactions after administration of the vaccines. The major side effects are sore arms, fever, chills, those kinds of things. Those are much more common after the 2nd dose than after the 1st dose, because it's your T cell system that's kicking in. The serious ones are this clotting problem with the adenovirus vaccines, which again, exceptionally rare. And then the myocarditis, the heart muscle inflammation in adolescent males. Those are the larger ones that have actually had a very specific look at them by CDC. This is approved for use in pregnancy and is recommended for use in pregnancy. I have young adult daughters whose friends are all pregnant all the time. And so I get asked a lot of questions about this in pregnancy. If you're planning pregnancy, get vaccinated before you get pregnant. Okay. If you're already pregnant, it depends on what kind of risk you have. So I have one daughter-in-law who's an emergency department nurse in a county near here where there's really high levels of COVID. So she got vaccinated in her first trimester. because getting COVID in pregnancy is a lot worse than getting the vaccine in pregnancy. And so she had a high risk of exposure. If someone were on bed rest and staying home through the entire pregnancy, you might want to wait until the third trimester, but you need to get vaccinated because you give your antibodies to the baby and it gives the baby 6 months of immunity. So that's the answer about pregnancy. Just anticipating that one.
Yeah, that is one of the questions. So, you've answered that one. Here's another question. What is the effect of taking Sinovac, complete 2 doses, and then 6 months later taking AstraZeneca?
It's probably not a lot. It'll to start with Sinovac and Sinopharm, which are the two of the Chinese vaccines. And this is different from CanSino. That's a different type of vaccine totally. But Sinovac and Sinopharm are inactivated vaccines, whole killed virus vaccines, 1960s technology. They work okay. They have relatively, compared to these other vaccines, they have much lower vaccine effectiveness and efficacy. But they still work. I mean, they're about 60%, 50-60% effective, which is about what flu vaccine is each year. So it's not ideal. And there have been situations, as I said, like in the Seychelles and in Chile, where large parts of the population have been given Sinovac or Sinopharm. And there has been ongoing transmission because of the vaccine failures associated with it. So if you have gotten that and you have a chance of getting another dose, either of AstraZeneca or Pfizer or J&J or whatever, I don't think it's a bad idea. But there are no specific recommendations around that.
Okay. Another question, what is the effect of HIV and malaria on vaccine-induced immune response? You touched on this a little bit.
Yeah, malaria is not a problem, I don't think, unless I have not heard this at all. And we'll start developing some of the data around it. The Brazilians have large vaccine programs, including way up in the Amazon where there's tons of malaria. So I think that's probably not an issue. HIV, it depends on how well the HIV is controlled. If it's well controlled, you'll have good immune reactions to the vaccine. If it's poorly controlled, it may not work as well. But I can tell you that if you have HIV and you get COVID, you're a lot worse off than if you have HIV and have gotten vaccinated. The only thing you're going to see with the vaccine is a vaccine failure. With actual getting COVID with HIV, more likely to have to be hospitalized, more likely to have a complicated hospital course.
Okay. Here's you talked about this a little bit. This question is it true when you are COVID positive and get the vaccine, you are in danger of developing heart problems?
No, that's incorrect. Unfortunately, I'm sorry. I don't mean to be harsh about this, but that's incorrect. There are no evidence for that. The myocarditis that we've seen in young adolescent boys is absent, whether they were previously infected or not. That's actually been very specifically looked at, and there's no evidence for it.
There's another question about mixing vaccines. I think you already.
Angela Merkel, call her up. I can give you her phone number. You can call her up and ask how it went.
If you get AstraZeneca and have the opportunity to do another one, should you do it?
I don't know. Clearly, if you're in Europe, that's what they're doing. In the EU, yeah. I mean, not in Britain, but in the EU, that's what they're doing. If they've gotten a first AstraZeneca dose and there's a chance to get Pfizer, they do it. Now, the studies are ongoing, trying to evaluate that and come up with a real evidence base for it. But right now, it seems to be relatively common practice in Europe.
It's also being done in Canada. I have friends in Canada who got one for their first and a different one for their second. So
it's better to have two than one, unless it's a
yeah.
gene.
Okay. Here's another question. With the vaccines being very focused to the spike protein, do they affect how our body's immunity to respond to other viruses if exposed in the future? Do they compromise the body's immunity?
No, they don't. There may be some cross immunity. You may get some immunity against other coronaviruses, but that's not really well established at all. All coronaviruses have spike proteins. That's what the why they call them coronaviruses, because it looks like they have crowns with spikes on it. So those are all the spike proteins sticking off the edge of the virus. They are especially some of the beta coronaviruses, which cause the older ones, which cause upper respiratory infections. There may be some benefit against those. We just don't know, and I don't think anybody's banking on it at all. So if anything, there would be some additional benefit, not a risk.
Another is it a problem if you don't get a second dose of the vaccine, especially in countries where these might not be available? I think that just means you're not protected.
Well, if you got J&J, if J&J is really floating through South Africa, I mean, Marina says it is, so it is. If you get J&J, one dose is fine. That's what it's designed to do. If you have the ones that require 2 shots, then you need to get a second shot. Now, it can be for some of the mRNA vaccines like Pfizer, you have fairly high protection after the first dose, right? But in order to get the really high levels of protection that you need to stop this disease, you need the second dose. Now, timing is such that if you miss the 3-week window, that doesn't matter. You can go out several months. You're just only partially protected during that interval. So, you shouldn't quit after 1 dose unless you had the J&J vaccine.
Okay. Another question, what form of SARS-CoV-2, the wild type or variant, underlies breakthrough infections of vaccinated individuals?
So this is a great question. Thank you. Thank you very much. So when you talk about vaccination failure, okay, the first thing to remember is that the reason people get vaccine preventable diseases is because they didn't get vaccinated. So it's, as CDC loves to say, it's failure to vaccinate rather than vaccine failure is the most common cause that these things happen. And in the US, 99% of people who are being reported with SARS-CoV-2 infection now have been unvaccinated, right? So the first thing is that you didn't get vaccinated. That's the first reason we see these things. The second reason is that the vaccine is mishandled and it goes into your body as basically sterile water. That the proteins have denatured, if it's a live virus vaccine, that virus has been killed off by handling. If it's one of the adenovirus vaccines, you've killed off the adenovirus by mishandling it, basically allowing it to heat up. So mishandling is the second reason we see these things. And then the third reason is potential variants and changes between, and how people's immune system reacted the first time versus the second time. So far, we haven't been able to really differentiate that. There are a handful of cases of people that were really well studied who had infection once and then got it again. And there's some difference in the viruses. But with naturally acquired infection, maybe, which is why we want people to get vaccinated even if they've had natural infection. But with the vaccines, it seems to be pretty standard across all the variants. And the reason I would suspect the reason that we see most of these vaccine failures, the fourth reason is that people don't respond because they're immunocompromised. They're really old. Those sorts of reasons, because of drugs, because of underlying disease like HIV, or because of being elderly. So those are the reasons, and I think most of the vaccine failures we see fall into that last category, that where the vaccines are being very carefully handled now because they're being given by health departments. So as we move down into pediatric vaccines later this year, they'll be start giving out in doctors' offices, and they'll start seeing, problems with vaccine handling. But right now in the U.S., what we're primarily seeing are people who are immunocompromised or elderly, which is a form of immunocompromise. And that's why we're seeing vaccine failures. And it doesn't really have to do with variants right now yet.
Okay, next question, what impact do the variants have on vaccine efficacy and diagnostic accuracy?
So the variants have no effect on diagnostic accuracy. In fact, there's some cute little tricks you can play with some of the diagnostic tests to pick up some of the variants, but they don't have an impact on diagnostic accuracy. In the U.S., where this has been carefully studied, they have minimal effect on, and in Europe, where this has been carefully studied, they have minimal effect on vaccine effectiveness. So, for instance, there was a Public Health England just released a preprint of a study where they looked at the effectiveness against hospitalization. And with the Delta variant, the Pfizer was 96% at vaccine effectiveness of 96% against hospitalization. And the AstraZeneca had 92% effectiveness against hospitalization after 2 doses. So that's all pretty good. And there are a lot of data emerging from the UK and Israel now that I think are quite reassuring about how well the vaccines work against the variants.
Another question relating to pregnancy. What's the best vaccine for second trimester pregnancy?
By anyone you can get, frankly. If you have the luxury, I'd wait till 3rd trimester, but that's just me as a pediatrician talking. Fetal life is fragile, and I think you can wait till you get a little bit more robust. If you can wait, if you're not being constantly exposed, like you're a nurse or something, or a doctor, I'd wait. I would consider waiting till the 3rd trimester. But right now, all the vaccines are approved for use in pregnancy.
Okay, and a few more questions. What is your comment regarding the use of ivermectin, doxycycline, and zinc cocktail that is currently being debated in most forums lately? We know it was used for parasitic infections long back.
Yeah. Ivermectin is a great drug if you have onchocerciasis, but that's been studied carefully, and these kinds of things have no effect. It's along with right up there with hydroxychloroquine as having no effect. The way to do this is supportive care. If you're sick, the most important drug you can get is oxygen, and which is what India ran out of at one point in time with their big surge in hospitalizations. And there are antiviral drugs. Remdesivir is one, and there are these monoclonals that remdesivir is an antiviral, and there are some monoclonals that have come out that we use here. If you can get them, that's great, but they're they're marginal. They're a marginal benefit, and most of the time we use them to keep people who aren't in the hospital, to keep them out of the hospital. People who have sort of kind of edgy oxygen saturations and stuff, sort of teetering at the edge of desaturating.
Okay, and this is the last question I have so far. Are there any studies currently being done in relation to producing a dry vaccine that may have less mishandling issues, especially in lower income countries?
Yeah. So the Chinese vaccines, the inactivated vaccines, can be used as dry vax, and so that's one of their big advantages. The disadvantage is they don't work as well. So yeah, it's obviously on the agenda, and it's being pushed. Some things like the J&J vaccine are not as brutally sensitive to heat extremes. So just to give you an example, when the mRNA vaccines first came out, they had to be refrigerated at minus 70 degrees centigrade. Okay, so first of all, nobody has a minus 70 degrees centigrade freezer hanging around their office, because if you stick your arm in it, it would crack, it would fall off. So it's, and then it's gone to minus 20 degrees, which gets a little bit closer, that most laboratories have that capacity. But then some of the newer ones, some of the adenovirus vectored vaccines, especially the J&J, you can store at -5. So it becomes much more doable in those senses, but it's hardly, it's like the measles vaccine, right? You can't, if you have to distribute it widely and you have to distribute it by, say, motorcycle or something to get to more remote parts of the country, it really has to be, you really have to be careful about how you pack it in dry ice and stuff. So, yeah, you're right. This would be really helpful to have it, but ideally you'd like to have it for the vaccine technology that produces the greatest effect.
So those are all the questions.
7:52, Jane. We timed this just right.
I know, that's great. I want to just say, if there are, if you have questions that you think of in an hour or tomorrow, you can always send them to me, and I will run those by Dr. Rutherford and get you answers. Thank you all for joining this call. This is a really important topic, and we want to keep all our global programs employees informed of the latest COVID information. George, anything else to add?
Yeah, I really encourage you to get vaccinated. And where vaccines are available, like Namibia, I know they're available, get vaccinated, please. We don't want to have, all these deaths are preventable, right? These are 100% preventable deaths. So I would very much encourage you to get vaccinated. We don't want to see anybody getting sick or dying among our global program staff or their families. Hopefully we'll be able to extend the Pfizer vaccine authorizations from WHO down to younger adolescents, so we can start moving on protecting younger and younger people and their families. But for right now, please get vaccinated. The best way to protect them is for you not to get infected.
Just checking to make sure. Thank you, George. Really appreciate it. It's been very, very helpful.
You bet. My pleasure. Good luck, everybody.